Welcome all to joining Michael Baker International's our broadband services first of our webinar series. Today's topic is the creation of the initial proposal. Our broadband services, we have several people here from our phenomenal broadband team today. Michael Baker is a firm with over 80 years of history. We are located and headquartered in Pennsylvania, but we operate nationally. And we offer a variety of different services, but our broadband services is a group that we've been growing throughout work in the broadband sphere over about 20 years and has evolved in the past 2 years or so to really grow a larger team that focuses on 3 core elements. We do data gathering and mapping, we do broadband planning, and we do program management. We have a dedicated team focused on broadband and broadband needs. And it's a big current issue at the moment. There's a lot of interest in broadband. The pandemic certainly revealed a lot of need for increased investment and increased expansion of broadband services. Not that it was unknown before then either. But with the passing of the the infrastructure law a few years ago, the IIJA has put an enormous amount of investment available to all of the states to do broadband planning, broadband deployment, and try to close the digital divide, try to get reliable broadband services to everyone across the United States. It's a large task, and we've got a great team here on this call to talk through what is involved with one of the main components involved in getting us to that finish line. We're going to be talking about the BEAD program today, and specifically talking about the requirements of the initial proposal within that. So again, really big topic, but we're happy to have you all here today. And with that, we're going to do some brief introductions. I am Kirsten Compitello. I will be the moderator for today's panel, and I am the National Digital Equity Director for our broadband services. And I would like to go to our panelists to each introduce themselves.
Hello, my name is John Kreitz. I am the broadband consultant for Michael Baker, 38 years in the telecommunications and data industry.
My name is Chris Taylor. I am a project manager for Michael Baker International. I have 25 years of telecommunication services, all the way from engineering to capacity management and program management and process improvement, and now working in the project management space.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Uriah Hunt. I'm a broadband and digital equity planner here at Michael Baker, and I have about 10 years of planning experience.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining us today. As I said earlier, the webinar is being recorded. And if you do have questions, feel free to use the Q&A throughout. We will address them during the discussion if it's suitable, but we'll also be taking some questions at the end. So use the questions throughout and wait for that Q&A session at the end. So with that said, we're here talking about initial proposals, and we're going to launch right in. We're going to start with a bit of level setting question. There's a lot of different understanding out there about what BEAD involves and what the different steps and stages are. So throughout this year, states will each be preparing an initial proposal, which will be due 6 months after the new broadband maps are released. With those maps due at the end of June, the FCC is planning to have updates of their new national map posted in June. That means that states and territories will have their clocks starting. They will each need to be submitting an initial proposal within 6 months of that date of submission of those new maps. So throughout summer and fall, we're anticipating that all 50 states, as well as the territories, are going to be talking about this topic of the initial proposal. So John, I'd like to put the first question over to you. Can you explain a bit to our attendees here today what an initial proposal is and how that relates to the 5-year action plan?
Sure. So to get started, we probably ought to touch on the 5-year action plan a little bit, which is the plan for an eligible entity to establish its broadband goals and priorities and serve as a comprehensive needs assessment that will inform initial plans. It's a feeder into the initial plans. The initial proposal will detail how an eligible entity, the state, intends to use its BEAD funding, which includes some significant challenges here, how it will design and challenge, how it will design and present its challenge process. The challenge process has just had some new guidance brought about. I think on April 25th, it was presented as a proposed challenge process, which you can find on NTIA's website. And I think it's something that everybody should go take a look at. It's pretty in-depth. The other thing that will be included is the competitive sub-grantee selection process. That is governed by the Code of Federal Regulations. So 2 CFR 200, specifically 317 through 327. And within there, 319 is something to pay attention to. It talks about the open competition. It will explain how the entity intends to ensure that every resident has access to a reliable, affordable, high-speed broadband connection, utilizing all the funding that can be brought to bear to accomplish this goal, including but not limited to BEAD funds. So that's a big statement. That includes a lot. But I think the first thing to really think about is, what does access mean? And I think that question is something that the states have to ask themselves, these broadband offices have to ask themselves. Does access mean that a location can attach and get a connectivity to the network because the fiber or whatever connectivity is going by is accessible there? Or does access mean that the service is already in the not already, but the service will be in the location? In other words, does access include the drop to the location? Does access mean that the funding is going to be spent to put cabling inside of multiple dwelling units or some sort of wireless access inside of there? So there is some different, by different states, even smaller entities, counties with other funding, there is different interpretations. There is, different intent on how to spend these monies. And so I think it's important to kind of ask that question: what does access mean, and how are we going to apply the funding? The initial proposal also details actions that the eligible entity will take on critical issues like climate resiliency, fair labor practices, workforce development, minority and women-owned business contracting. All of that is going to be included in that initial proposal. So while the initial proposal and the 5-year action plan are separate documents, a well-crafted 5-year action plan is critical to the full and complete development of the initial proposal. And on the NTIA website, the 5-year action plan guidance document is a very good document to read and understand. It is full of information to help navigate those waters. Kirsten.
Yeah, thank you, John. And we're going to be diving into talking a little bit more about what is involved with the initial proposal and what the timelines are. But we also have a question from an applicant that I think we can go ahead and take now, because from one of our attendees, because this is also really important, just understanding how the BEAD program works. We have a question from John Timney regarding how BEAD funding is allocated, and is there a preferred applicant, ISP, government agency, other? I think we're going to get into answering that throughout the webinar, but perhaps we can start off with a little bit of level setting about how that funding is being allocated to start. Currently, each of the states has received some planning funds. And John, perhaps you can describe how the initial proposal will start to unlock the next level of funding.
Sure. So the BEAD process, the BEAD funding has 3 process stages. States will have requested their initial planning funds. Those requests would have had to have been in by August 15th of 2022. It's my understanding that all states did request initial planning funds, and those were all awarded before the end of 2022. So all states would have gotten those that initial $5 million. So that money helps the broadband offices in these states create their 5-year action plan, which is their foundational document, and it helps align the grantees with the future initial and final proposals. So that plan is due within 270 days of receipt of the initial planning funds. Now, I don't know what states got what money when. I just know that through some research that it appears that they all got it before the end of the year. So that would mean that likely these the 270 days is going to come due August, September timeframe. Could be a little earlier if they got their money before say November, right? So if they got their money in November, it's going to be due August. If they got it in December, it'll be due September. Yeah, so it could be earlier. Now, the assistant secretary reserves the right to extend the deadline, but it's not likely because there would have to be some really, big extenuating circumstances for them to do that. So the 5-year action plan guidance provides information about the intent of the program. It has 13 requirements that must be met. Those requirements are encapsulated in 6 sections of the plan: the executive summary, overview of the 5-year action plan, current state of broadband and digital inclusion, obstacles or barriers, implementation plan, and conclusion. One of the things that I wanted to note that's key about this is that requirement 11 of that 5-year action plan may be satisfied by the completion of the state digital equity plan under the state digital equity plan guidance program. So that's a completely separate $2.75 billion grant funding program that is designed to work in concert with BEAD. So the second process, the initial proposal, is the first draft of the final proposal. And the intent of this document is for the grantee to explain to the NTIA how the grantee intends to ensure that every resident has access to reliable, affordable, high-speed broadband connection. So again, here's that access, the thing to consider. What does that mean? The initial proposal is a required submission for any eligible entity to use to apply for BEAD funding. The initial proposal should explain the process by which the eligible entity will award sub-grants to ensure that every resident has access. I think I just said that. It focuses on implementation, identifies more specifically how and where the state is going to fund broadband infrastructure projects, and includes developing a process to award funds to sub-grantees, and defines who qualifies as a sub-grantee. So I think you had a portion of a question there about sub-grantees and who qualifies as a sub-grantee. And that is covered in the Code of Federal Regulations as well. So, states are open to have a sub-grantee process. I think they could also have a contract process where the state itself is going to govern all the money. I don't know that they would want to do that. It's likely that they would want to sub-grantee that money out to a other entity like a county or a city. And then they in turn can make choices about whether or not they're going to have a sub-grantee grant process, or if they're going to go straight to contract through an RFP process. So those are choices that can be made. Again, as Kirsten had said, the initial proposal is due no later than 180 days after the grantee has provided notice of the total allocation of BEAD funds, which is basically in line with the updated maps release that is expected in June. So the allocations will be released to the states when the new national map is released. Once they have received notification of what their funding amount is going to be, then they will be able to move forward with that initial plan. Couple more things here, Kirsten. The NTIA is going to provide a template for submission of those proposals online. Those proposals have 19 elements to them, and I would recommend using the BEAD FAQ document as a good reference document. The latest version is online. That unlocks the 20%, the initial 20% of the funds that they are going to allocate to a state based on the maps of unserved locations. That's a key note there. It's the unserved locations. And then they can unlock that 20%, start using it, but it is conditional. If you want me to talk about that some more, Kirsten, I can.
Yeah, no, that was all really great information. And I suppose if we could just circle back for a moment to follow up on the question that was asked. I think you've already talked about it, but in terms of when those BEAD funds for deployment become available, the first 20% will be available once the initial proposal is received by the NTA and approved. The remaining funds will be received by each state once the final proposal is received by the NTIA and approved. We can anticipate that likely ISPs and counties or government entities may all be able to be eligible sub-grantees, but we can't really know the specifics yet because each state is on the hook to create their own standards and their own sub-grantee process. Would you say that that's fair, John?
I would say that
expectation?
that's absolutely a fair expectation. And the 20%, just to kind of make everybody aware, the 20% is conditional use. There are only certain things that it can be used for. There's a list of about 11 different things that it can be used for. I think it's key to note, though, that there are a couple of instances where the 20% can be used for deployment, but it is really not intended for that. It's intended for, creating all these processes and helping the office do all the planning and everything to get to the acceptance of that initial proposal.
But what is in that initial proposal should give a lot more details to any, entities who are hoping to become eligible applicants, entities who are hoping to be sub-grantees should be keeping an eye on their state's 5-year action plan and their state's initial proposal. That all should be available and completed by the end of this year.
Yep.
Right, because each state will have that 180 days starting in June when that map drops.
Mm-hmm.
Each state will have 180 days. So by the end of this year, everyone should know more about what their state is intending to do with their funds. Well, a lot of things to really dive into here, but we're going to give you a break, John, and I'm going to tag Chris on the next question. Chris, this BEAD program is aimed at providing universal broadband, which is a really, really big task. It's going to take a lot of investment, likely beyond the $65 billion that have already been allocated through the IIJA program. And so as part of this 5-year action plan and initial proposal and final proposal process, states are looking for ways to efficiently and successfully deploy broadband. Finding those ways is a big part of the initial proposal. So if we're speaking about the costs associated, can you speak a bit to some of the mechanisms that states can use to reduce their costs and barriers to deployment?
Yes, absolutely. So there are several things that come out to reduce cost. A dig once policy, where a large construction project is going on, you're able to open up a trench one time, put multiple infrastructure in that is accessible to an ISP, a private entity, or the owner, if it's the DOT or anyone like that who wants to own that. And in doing that, in those construction projects, a lot of times those things, especially the larger ones, it gets pushed out that we can't do that because that adds more complexity to the project. And it, of course, is going to add cost, and it's the upfront cost, but that upfront cost is going to far outweigh the short-term costs are going to far outweigh any of the long-term benefits that would come from that. Another example is in new construction or greenfield builds, new neighborhoods, joint trench opportunities, where one trench can be opened and all utilities get in it. Now, this takes coordination with all the utilities, to be able to have that opportunity to get in and get out of a neighborhood all in one fell swoop instead of everybody coming in and open up a trench and digging it. One pushback that is happening in dig once policies, there is the ISPs are pushing back against this policies, and they're lobbying against it because they don't want to add a infrastructure for a competitor to come in and make inroads into where they have a heavily entrenched market. So they don't want to do that. So all these things are available for that. You know, another thing that would reduce costs is streamlined permitting. With all 50 states fixing to be able to request funds and being able to work on projects, everybody's going to be submitting permits, whether it's local permits, state permits, and even at the federal level. You know, you're going to have some way of streamlining permits, because we know some federal permits could take months, and months take away from the build process and being able to build that. Another thing that really needs to be looked at is being looked at several opportunities is make ready costs. You know, in the aerial environment with new builds coming in, this can be a very high cost issue, especially at some of the older pole lines that exist across the country. You know, one solution would be able to have a group of the power, the cable TV companies, and telecom coming together, you know, having a contractor or even have one of those companies take on that one touch program, so that when they go out to a new pole is there, they're able to transfer everybody at one time. Of course, power is different because you have to be certified in the power space, you know, so that's all, you know, so mostly it's the power companies going out there and place the pole, you know, and they usually place the pole and go on to the next one, you know, and then it's up for the cable TV, telecom to come down and transfer. You know, by being able to do all of this at one time, it's going to save lots of time, lots of opportunity. Another concern in that I brought up first is cost. Cost is something that, you know, the power company wants to pass on to the other thing, even though the power company is getting the benefit of a bigger and a newer pole. And so that's going to have to be discussed, and possibly in using some of these dollars to be able to, these grant funds, to be able to help out the power company and spread the cost across everybody, and then being able to move forward in that process.
It's certainly going to be an expensive endeavor, which is why there's so much effort up front to do the planning efforts and get the policies in order and identify what kinds of collaborative structures, what kinds of policy changes are needed to help, you know, really streamline and make for a successful and effective deployment of broadband for all. I think we started off with this webinar acknowledging this is a big lift. There's a lot of work that's going to be done in the next few years. We're going to circle back for a moment here. We're talking about a lot of really big topics. And I know we've touched on a little bit the different phases related to funding, but we want to come back to this and really make it very clear. So John, I'm going to bring this one back to you for a moment. Can you just describe again, try to lay it out for us clearly, how the initial proposal relates to funding opportunities for broadband infrastructure? You're going to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Sorry. So, you know, when we talk about funding opportunities, we're kind of, you know, in my mind, we're talking about a couple of different things. So we're talking about the funding that BEAD produces out of that IIJA law. But then we're also talking about other funding opportunities to kind of help with that. And there's lots of other programs that they've come and gone, and there's some that are, you know, active right now that allow for additional funding. Now, typically, one source of funding from the federal government can't be used for another program, but they have made exceptions in BEAD to allow for certain funding that's already been provided to apply to the BEAD program, because there is a 25% match there. So the CARES Act, ARPA law, which allows for the SLFRF and the CPF funding to actually be used as part of that 25% match. But there's also the opportunity to get matching funds from the ISPs themselves. What are they willing to put forward to help build out these networks? Because at the end of the day, they're going to be the beneficiary of this. The end user is the beneficiary because they're going to get network they didn't have before, and that's due to the fact that ISPs are businesses, and when they look at where they're going to build out their network, they're looking at ROI. And sometimes these rural areas, it doesn't make sense for them to do it. They're never going to get the money back for it. So this is where our government steps in and helps us, and they're allocating these funds. So the funding opportunity, for this particular, for the NOFO here is obviously there's 100 million automatically granted to the states, and then on top of that 100 million, based on that map, the updated maps, the fabric there is going to, based on their math on how they determine what those unserved locations are going to, how they're going to be served and the money it's going to take, they're going to be allocated likely more money than the 100 million minimum allocation. And I've seen through some research that, there's some states, for example, I think Texas, they're looking at possibly 3 billion or more for Texas. And that comes due because, or that comes about because some of these locations that are unserved, because they're rural, the cost to getting to them is going to be super expensive. So when they look at those, they're looking at those as a high cost area. So they're going to allocate more funding to those states to get to those high cost areas. So that's kind of the funding opportunity, Kirsten, the way I see it. States can choose to use those other programs to help fund that 25%. That when you look at it, could create an initiative, an incentive rather, for a ISP to look at these areas, to help partner on those areas, to get that service out to those people. There's a lot of other information in here that I could go over, but in the essence of time and making sure that everybody has an opportunity to speak here, I think I'll turn it back to you if you have a question about that.
Yeah, thank you, John. And we do have a couple of questions that I think we'll come back to for the Q&A. Okay. Like you said, John, it's a really big topic, and we could have spent quite a lot of time diving into all the details, but we did want to go on and address another key topic of the initial proposal. There is also a requirement for local coordination. We want to talk a little bit about that and then still leave some time for Q&A at the end as well. So as we're talking about trying to get universal broadband across every state, and each state is putting together their 5-year action plan and then putting together an initial proposal to figure out how are they going to put together the processes that they need to coordinate the kind of deployment. How are they going to identify their unserved areas? How are they going to establish their sub-grantee process? How are they going to manage how they allocate those funds and who they work with and who they partner with, and where things are even needed, where service is even needed, where there are projects already underway, and what the end community needs are as well. There's quite a large requirement for local coordination. That is the term used in the BEAD NOFO. And it is involved at each step of the process, but it is particularly, it has specific requirements during the initial proposal phase. States and territories need to be coordinating with communities across their states, with agencies, with ISPs and service providers, as well as other key stakeholders. So I'm going to put this question to Uriah. to describe to us and walk us through a little bit the requirements that are laid out for the BEAD process and specifically for the initial proposal. Uriah, pass it over to you.
All right, thank you. So yeah, thank you. Kirsten gave a lot of information about some of the requirements, but what I wanted to speak about are the requirement that BEAD makes it possible and requires that each eligible entity have their own local coordination plan. And it starts off with the development of the 5-year action plan, and it continues throughout the entire process and deployment of the BEAD program. There are 5 main requirements that I'll get into shortly. And the reason why I'm mentioning the 5-year action plan is because as part of the initial proposal, you'll need to record and explain what coordination engagement efforts were done with your community, and then include that in the initial proposal. The NOVO also encourages aligning your BEAD activities with activities you're planning or planned already as part of the Digital Equity Act, and you have to include that. So as I mentioned before, 5 local coordination and outreach requirements. So all your engagement efforts should have full geographic coverage of the eligible entity. So all the tribal areas, rural areas, suburban and urban areas will need to be covered in your coordination plans. So you need to be engaging with all these groups. Your engagement should be meaningful and engage and reach diverse stakeholder groups. We'll talk more about what those diverse stakeholder groups will be. And you need to utilize your various awareness, outreach, and participation mechanisms. Be transparent of your processes by releasing periodic reports and up-to-date information to your constituents. And lastly, include all your underrepresented communities in your engagement efforts.
Yeah, that's a lot of great information, Uriah. So I wonder if you could describe to us a little bit. Can you share a little bit about who states and territories should be engaging with and some recommended approaches for successful local coordination?
Sure. Since the goal is to engage with diverse stakeholder groups, you want to make sure you're connecting with political subdivisions and state and territorial agencies, such as departments or offices that oversee transportation, economic development, community development, education, counties, and regional associations of governments. You want to make sure you're touching on the tribal governments, Alaska Native entities, Native Hawaiian organizations, and all their political subdivisions and federally recognized tribes. Local community-based organizations, unions and worker organizations, civil rights organizations, and nonprofits too. The NOFA recommends bringing together all these local stakeholders and communities because they're already doing work in the broadband space and have already done data collection and planning and identify their community's needs. So now your job is to keep that open line of communication between all your stakeholders and make sure that you tailor your communications toward them so they understand what the initial proposal means for them and how they might be impacted by your plans when you put them out. The NOFO has a list of successful engagement methods, and I'll list them here. So hosting listening sessions or public meetings that you can host in person or virtually if needed, allowing public comment through email and the websites that your organization runs, printing and developing information on materials such as fact sheets, brochures, FAQs, and newsletters, using social media, email, physical mail, and reaching out to your community anchor institutions and to promote and distribute the information that you want to disseminate, and also putting out local advertisements and public service announcements. So the other thing I wanted to address are the requirements for public comment, because that's a really big part of this entire process. And accepting public comment or having a public review period is a very effective way to solicit feedback on plans. So if you're planning to receive BEAD funds, you have to make sure that the initial proposal is available for public review before you submit it to the NTIA. Whether that's in paper form or online, or however you plan to post it, we suggest giving the public a minimum of 30 days to submit their comments and review the proposal, and then give yourselves enough time to, after the review period ends, to address those comments and review them and explain how those comments were addressed before you submit it back to the NTIA, because that's a requirement. This public review period is a little different than the 5-year action plan, which doesn't have a review period. But this period, you want to make sure you give your stakeholders and your community members and tribal members an opportunity to read through the entire proposal to know what's in there. Because by now you'll have a list. By that time, you'll have a list of your unserved and underserved locations that you would have gotten through that Broadband Maps website. So the public will know what areas you're going to be targeting for deployment during the implementation phase. So the last thing I want to cover in terms of that, that a lot of times these plans are developed with little or no input from the community they're actually affecting. So it's really important to get that plan out for those 30 days minimum. Some people do 60 days also, but minimum 30 days, so that when the period is over, you can make adjustments and make sure all those concerns are addressed, because the Assistant Secretary is going to review those.
Thanks so much, Uriah. And just to kind of close the circle on that one, you're talking a lot about the public review process. Just to clarify for our audience here, the initial proposal is something that every state and territory who received BEAD funds is going to be preparing, and that entity, that state or territory, would then be responsible for putting together a public review period, hosting a public review period, and allowing stakeholders and members of the public to comment on it. So for those in our audience today who are with the state, they might be on that side. For those who are not with the state, then this is, their input would be to look for that public comment review period. That would be a point at which, if they haven't been engaged yet, they should be looking for the initial proposal public comment review period, probably around November, December. If we think about the time frame every state will be on, there should be an open public review period of the initial proposal. So hopefully, of all of our attendees, if you're looking to see what your state is doing, keep an eye out for that period. With that, we are just about 40 minutes in, and we do have a few questions. So I'm going to start going to our questions here and having our panelists address some of the questions. So I'm actually going to start with the most recent question here, because this seems to be jumping right off of what we were just speaking about. We have a question about the plans that we're talking about. Are we talking about the state plan for BEAD, or are we referring to the plans that subrecipients or sub-grantees will be writing and submitting to the state broadband office? Does anyone want to take that one? I can launch it off and clarify. I think most of what we've been talking about are the state plans. We've been talking about how the state, what is involved in putting together an initial proposal, and that is on the state side. But John, if you want to elaborate a little further.
Yeah, I was just going to say the same thing, that we're talking about state plans here. When states decide what process they're going to follow and how they're going to distribute this money, they're likely going to do a sub-grantee process. And when they do that, they will pass on some requirements from the Code of Federal Regulations down to sub-grantees, and some requirements they will maintain on their own because they have to. There's some things they can't pass off. So when it comes to these plans, it is likely that they are going to pass off responsibilities and requirements for plans for the sub-grantees grant program that will help them feed up when they're reporting back to the Fed as far as the success of their programs and the other auditing and other requirements that they will have to fulfill.
Yeah, a lot of components to it, but I think that was a pretty good answer. Hopefully that responded to the person who posted it, but we'll keep the questions open if there are further clarifications requested. We have a few other questions here, and I'm going to go to the first one that's been waiting for us to get to it. There was a question about how will states determine if unserved or underserved addresses have been already funded through CAT2 or RDOF or ACAM or other funding mechanisms outside of BEAD.
So I think that is covered as part of the challenge process. They're bringing about the challenge process to try to help uncover those things, because if one entity has already been given federal funding and maybe they haven't deployed yet, but they've gotten federal funding to deploy to an area, they're going to want to make sure that there isn't other federal funding coming in that might hit and build before their planned events happen, and now they're not available, they're not able to build to that with their funding dollars, and they lose out on those dollars and possibly already investment that they've made. So that, I think that's a part of the challenge process. I think that's going to cover a lot of that, but also, you know, it's going to be up to the state entity to know what other programs that they have received funding for, how that money has been spent, and on what areas that they have already funded for build. It's also going to be on the states. You don't want to have a clawback because it was uncovered 5 years from now or something that there was an overbuild on an area.
Right,
Yeah.
and there's a question building upon that. Sorry, I'll just go ahead with the question first, and then Chris, if you had additions. There's a question building upon that about what are your thoughts regarding that FCC funding map that will serve as the basis for what areas are ineligible for BEAD? Should RDOF areas be ineligible?
Yeah, I can't speak to that, but I was going to bring up the fact that there is a grant map that is to be able to take the unserved that already have a grant pending, so you can pull those from your list of total unserved. And I don't know, you know, like I said, I can't speak to if RDOF areas, should they be ineligible or not. I don't really want to go down that rabbit hole.
A little bit.
Yeah.
Can't make the rules, right? But
right, we don't make the rules, and we don't know what the interpretations are going to be, right? So later on, you know, we don't know who's going to be interpreting what's been done and how they view the rules. I would say that if I were a state agency, I would be very careful about allocating funding where I know that funding has already been placed, because it could end up being, you know, challenged by the entity that already received those funds. And even though the deployment may still be pending, you know, they've received those funds, and I would just want to steer clear of that and make sure that you know, there's plenty of follow-up and plenty of guarantee that they are going to deploy, and maybe try to use some efforts to get that to move forward faster. I have seen some efforts in that way where, you know, an entity may decide, okay, well, I'm going to use this particular funding to push into an RDOF area for funding for locations that may not have been covered by the RDOF monies, and then that creates or stimulates some urgency on the entity that did receive the RDOF dollars that hasn't yet gone in there, right? So it's I've seen this kind of leveraging and push going on, and I'd be a little concerned about that. So I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, and I also wanted to mention that it's going to be up to the states and the states' responsibilities to make sure that they're disclosing funding sources that they're possibly going to use if it's not showing up on that map. Because once the map comes out, there are still going to be states that have their own funding sources that you know, you can't use in addition to other funding sources. So we have to make sure that we cover those things too.
yeah, that's a good clarification. In addition to the national map, each state is, you know, through their 5-year action plan, and then with the initial proposal as well, each state is working on updating their own mapping to various different degrees, and then they do have to take stock of what funding they have available, what funding programs they are putting into broadband programs. And like John mentioned earlier, some sources allow the combination of different funds, and other funding sources do not allow mix and match. So it's kind of a complex scenario of what funding can be used where. But that actually ties into another question that we have here that I do want to make sure we address, which is, will BEAD take into account the underserved with speeds of less than 100/20? This is a really important thing to keep in mind, because BEAD does have certain priorities. It prioritizes funding programs, funding infrastructure for areas that are unserved with speeds of under 25/3 download upload, and then underserved with speeds of under 100 100 over 20 of download and upload speeds. And then it does allow for funding of other types of programs and infrastructure as well, including improvements to MDU units. But to go back to the main point, it has priorities built in, and other funding sources have different types of priorities. So I'm just going to repeat that question again. Will BEAD take into account the underserved with speeds of under 100 by 20? And if any of the panelists would like to take that on and elaborate further.
I think I'd like to hit that a little bit. I think it does in a way, right? There's some complexities there though, because we have to be careful about overbuild. And I've seen a couple of different definitions about overbuild. There's nothing super clear as far as I'm concerned. Does overbuild mean that you can't build in an area with federal funding that has already been built with federal funding, right? Is that the definition of overbuild, or is the definition of overbuild an area that is already served regardless of who funded it, and they're at the, you know, above 25.3 but under 120 as underserved? It's already built. Are we going to allow the dollars to be spent there as long as we're going through the area, right? But then there's some other complexities there about, you know, how much of that area is. There's that 80% underserved equation that goes in there. And it depends on the bucket of money that you're applying. There's just so many complexities there that you have to weigh through that. You have to really understand what's being said in the different buckets of money and how they're being applied, to make sure that those underserved locations can be served. Now, if you're passing through and you actually can legitimately pass through there with new infrastructure, there's no reason in the world why those underserved locations cannot now be served with a higher speed, right? But what the money is trying to do is get to those areas and extend those dollars used to get to those areas that are not served, and try to cover all of it. So they don't want to spend money in areas that they shouldn't be, and that's where these rules get so complex. And it's you just got to really read through that and understand it. That would be my response. I know Chris had something to say.
Yeah, and I was going to give an example. You know, we have in some of our 5-year action plan where we're dealing with cost and timeline, and we're showing these unserved areas. We're capturing those on a map, and we're capturing them in clusters to kind of say, hey, these are the real ones we need to go get. Well, then I've asked our GIS team to, hey, pull in the underserved as a layer and add it on top. And as you see that, those people that are going to that unserved area, to the unserved area, are going to pass a whole lot of underserved, and they're going to be able to pick them up, just like John mentioned. So in a roundabout way, the answer is yes, but not directly, because I think that really when you get to the funds that are going to be allocated, the unserved are going to be strictly needed for that full amount.
Yeah, so we should have more information going into the fall as states are putting together, releasing their 5-year action plans, right? That will have their high-level approaches and costs to universal broadband, and then also starting to prepare their initial proposals that detail how they're going to go about putting together, you know, their approaches towards deployment and their approaches towards working with sub-grantees. We should get a better sense of which states think that they're going to have enough funds to go beyond the unserved, and you know, and which states are really using all their available BEAD funds just to do that, because each state's going to be in a different position, right?
Absolutely.
But those are all still ongoing, and that ties into another question that we have here, which I think is a good one to really clarify. Have any states announced or launched their sub-grantee processes yet? And if not, when are the first states expected to roll out those sub-grantee processes?
I don't think a state has yet done that.
Not that I'm aware of.
not in our exposure so far. I have seen from other programs, county size entities launching into sub-grantee process, like from CPF funding. So, but the states haven't done that yet and likely won't even begin that process until after their initial proposal has been submitted, their challenge process has gone through, because they cannot even begin the sub-grantee process until the challenge process is complete. And they have, I think, 75 days for that challenge process, which doesn't have to happen until after their initial proposal has been put in. So yeah, I would say the answer to that is no, they haven't begun that yet.
And the initial proposal lays out a lot of things that have to be done by the state, that they have to lay out their process of what they're going to do to address, you know, these certain issues. And so they have to, hey, how are you going to choose the sub-grantees? You know, all of that needs to be laid out, and that's in the initial proposal that we're discussing.
And that's a really good point to make. We may be able to, come back to those timelines again. There is a good chance that each state, as it is in a different position right now, some of them may be further along than others, or, considering what they would like their sub-grantee process to be at different stages or from different approaches. But fundamentally, what's most likely to happen is that most states will not really start really dive into preparing their initial proposal until they find out what their allocation will be. And that will happen in June when the updated map is released. So we would expect, again, even if states are getting started in different ways, that they'll really be launching into preparing their initial proposals in June. They'll have 180 days. So we're expecting that most states will be submitting those initial proposals to the NTIA by the end of the year. And they'll all have to go through a public review process. So your first chance to really look at what those initial proposals look like and what their sub-grantee processes are outlined as being would be, late fall, November-ish, December-ish timeline when the public review processes are open. Again, potentially earlier for states that decide to start earlier. But then to John's point, there will be a public challenge, a challenge process. So even if you see what the sub-grantee process is state by state, once they do their public review, those sub-grantee processes won't actually be open until sometime next year after the challenge process is complete. John, Chris, did I miss anything? Is that a good summary?
I think that's correct.
Okay. Well, you all have some thanks for the great comments that you've made. There is one other question that is a fairly large question, and unfortunately we're running out of time, but I do want to say the question anyways, and we'll give a brief recap of what can be done to address this one. This final question is that given that tribal areas have been misrepresented and or left out of the fabric, which is that national map, what is the best way for tribes to address this issue? It's a big question, but we'll give a little bit of guidance, and maybe that's a topic for another day.
I think it is a topic for another day. I think that the FCC has provided some guidance specifically for tribal entities. So they have a different set of rules, slightly different to follow when it comes to the Code of Federal Regulations. There's some things that don't apply there. And I don't know about them being left out of the fabric. I can't validate that statement, whether that's true or not true. I don't know. Maybe the updated maps will change that point of view. But I think that it is a topic for another day. We might have might suggest another call for webinar for that, and we can delve more deeply into that. Would be my answer.
Yeah, well, thank you for taking that on.
I was going to say also the tribes can be, they can be sub-grantees to the state. They can ask for money, in that way from the state. Of course, after all, after the initial proposal is done and everything. So they can ask for funds.
That is true. Yes, all the plans that are all of the funding that will be available to states will be available to tribes within those states as well. They are eligible sub-grantees.
Correct.
All right, well, we have mostly taken up our hour here. We've made it through all of the questions that I've noticed. So we really appreciate everyone's time, appreciate our panelists for talking through such a complex issue. It really could have been much longer. The NOFO itself would probably take us longer than an hour just to read. But hopefully the recap summaries and some of the explanations and further insights shared on this webinar were helpful to all of our attendees. We appreciate the questions that were asked as well. The recording of this session has been recorded and it will be available on our website shortly, probably within a day or so after this. So if you'd like to refer to it again or share it with someone else who missed it, we will be making the recordings available on our website. And again, appreciate everyone attending today. You have a lot of thanks from those in the audience to our panelists. So I'll relay that to our panelists. Thank you to you all.
Thank you.
And again,
Thank you for attending.
we appreciate everyone joining our Baker webinar series. We will be having a regular series of these. So stay tuned for the upcoming topics and sessions.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.